My name is Miguel Ángel Osuna. I am an ocean-going master rank in the maritime shipping sector, and I am the president for the International ISPS Network. It is on behalf of the International ISPS Network and the Inter-American Committee in Ports. We welcome you to this webinar titled High-Level Cruise Industry Update and Environmental Aspect of Dredging and Port Safety. This event is the result of the collaboration between both institutions to address present challenges and their complexity across different sectors. We believe our joint effort with the CIP Secretariat, led by Mr. Jorge Duran, along with those of its associate members and strategic partners, will fulfill the webinar's participants' expectation through the communication of up-to-date information and best practice in the proposed topics. In context, we, the International ISPS Network, are over 2,000 people strong, all high-end professionals from all parts of life directly related to the marine and port industry, carrying out various responsibilities as security officers on behalf of the respective maritime and port authorities, shipping companies, and port terminals, and sometimes as advisors of international organizations like the IMO and ILO. Since 2005, we have been working on the creation and promotion of the best security practice derived from the application and correct interpretation of the ISPS code. All this thanks in part to the planning and management of the International ISPS Forum, a multimodal event spanning over 15 years, 9 countries, and reaching over 4,000 and 50,000 people directly and indirectly, respectively. Today, as strong strategic partner from the CIP, we strive toward high goals. We share the CIP vision and believe we can have great positive impact in the sector. For this and more, we can thank Mr. Jorge Duran, Chief of the CIP Secretariat, who without further delay, I welcome and give the word to. Thank you and welcome, George.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Miguel Ángel, for that lovely introduction. Thank you very, very much. Good morning, everyone. As Miguel has said, my name is Jorge Duran, and I am the chief of the CIP Secretariat. And with that, I see that I see friends, basically friends and family in our chat. I see Audrey McNeil and Curtis Denny and Glenn Roach and Fernando Melo and Jorge Baracat. And anyway, it's just to mention a few of the people that I managed to see. Rafael Diaz-Balart from AAPA is here as well, so I'd like to welcome him, along with the rest of the port authorities, maritime authorities, private ports and terminals that are with us today. So thank you very much. Welcome. In addition to this welcome, I would like to thank, first of all, La Red Mexico PVP, or Mexico's ISPS International Network, for partnering with us and being able to do these. And as you know, we have a cycle of events coming, of webinars. So thank you very much for that support. I'd also like to thank our strategic member, Piedrova Consulting Group. Piedrova, as you know, is a associate of the CIP, and they have been kind enough to dredging being their specialty. They have done different events in Lima, Peru, in Panama, and in the Dominican Republic, where they have offered at cost coming down to these countries and doing a seminar. There are 2 possibilities: a 1.5-day executive, a high-level seminar for executives, and then a 1-week-long, sort of more intense, more detailed seminar that is also designed for people who are going to get, boots on the ground. So for that, Piedrova, thank you very much for carrying, and thank you very much we were in fact discussing things with Mr. Telemac, with Darwin Telemac, in order to see if we could do something, a similar activity in the Caribbean, but then COVID came along, and here we are. So thank you, Piedrova. Today we will address three important topics that Miguel Angel mentioned. We will talk about something that is of interest to all of us, which is what is going on with the cruise industry. What is the status? You read something here, you read another thing there. So Piedrova, and by Jelly Prince, who is a partner of Piedrova, will take care of that part of the presentation, the update on the cruise report, what's going to happen. And this is especially important to all the people I mentioned before. And I've been working, the SIP has been working with the AAPA to reactivate the cruise industry, and we're trying to do something about it. So this is yet another example of how important this is, and I'd like to commend Rafael Diaz-Balart for his work on this as well. So again, welcome to everyone. Welcome to the seminar. The methodology, and with this I finish, and I'll give the floor to Jelly Prince to continue. The methodology is as follows. Those who have participated in SIP events before will know that throughout the presentation, you, the audience, the public, is welcome to ask questions through the chat mode. Now, these questions won't be seen by the presenter at the time. I and the SIP Dream Team, Mona and Paola, Sarina, Monse, the SIP Dream Team will act as moderators and will collect these questions, organize them by themes, by thematics, and then at the end of the three presenters, then we will ask the questions. So who is presenting today? I've mentioned Jelly Prince, who will present the update of the cruise industry, followed by Luis Prieto y Muñoz from Piedrova as well, who will present those important sustainability aspects of the dredging operations. And finally, we will have Miguel Angel Osuna Teran, not Miguel Angel Osuna, the one that just welcomed us, but Teran, who is his son and who is an expert in port safety matters. So without, like Miguel Angel said, any further ado, again, welcome to all of you who are here. I see 43 participants, and this number keeps growing little by little. So thank you very much. Also, I saw Glenn Roach here on this list somewhere. Ian Evans. It took me a while to go to everybody, but thank you for being here. We hope that this is of interest to you. And Jelly Prince, if you could please take the floor. I will ask Martin Santillan from our technological host, Real ID, to whom I offer my thanks and appreciation for their support for Real ID, without whom we would not be able to have it. So, Jelly, the floor is yours, sir. I will now disappear from screen, and I'll see you in 20 minutes.
Jorge, and let me first say thank you, and what a great job you're doing with Monse, Mona, and Paola to keep our community together through these webinars, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about cruise and dredging in the environment. My name is Jelly Prince. I'm with Piedrova Consulting Group. We manage marine infrastructure projects, and a lot of those are cruise projects, and being Miami-based, we feel we have a pretty decent pulse on what's going on with cruise, and we'd like to share that with you. So without further ado, we'll get into that and start the slide presentation here. So what will we cover today in these next 15 minutes? Well, you know, COVID-19 has been an absolute perfect storm, and the cruise industry, they call themselves the ground zero situation. This is almost as bad as 9/11 for them, except they're now very much at the heart of this. It remains very much a fluid situation with the world very much still in learning mode. They're really letting the scientific and the medical communities decide what the next steps are. And so you see a lot of unpredictability in the industry, with sailing dates being postponed and nobody knowing exactly what is going to happen when. But they're exercising a lot of patience. So in this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about when they might return, how will they return, and why have they been paused for so long. We do know that cruising will return when social gatherings will return. So when you're able to go back to your football match or go to a concert, then it's very likely that you should be able to go back on a cruise again. And certain aspects will remain what they were from how we know the cruising industry, and others new elements will be introduced, like contactless payments, for example. So this is a little image of the cruising parking lot outside the UK. It's a very sad image where you see a lot of these vessels tied up. It was very much a logistical nightmare to get all the cruises from the different ports out to a place where they could safely park. A big element of what we're seeing today is a difference in what's the perception and what's the reality. So you might understand that the cruise industry received a lot of blame and negative publicity in the early days of the COVID virus developing. And that's in large part because of what happened with the Princess vessels. We know the case with the Diamond Princess in Japan, where so many people got infected with the coronavirus. There were some unfortunate deaths, and that really created a negative image where even Dr. Fauci said, whatever you do, do not take a cruise. And so that image kind of stuck with the community. And it's not too different from the norovirus, which was also called the cruise line disease, where the actual virus was, you had a chance of 1 to 5,000 to catch it on a cruise line, on a cruise vessel, but it was actually a 1 to 15 in normal life. But however, because the cruises are a confined environment, the perception was that it was way unsafer to take a cruise than to be back on the mainland. The reality is that COVID-19 is a new virus. It's a novel virus, and how it's being transmitted and what is happening, it's still being researched by scientists. Recently, it came out that the aeromissile transportation through the cruise air filters played a big part of this, but it's still a developing story. We also know that a lot of attention goes to the crew morale and the repatriation efforts. You see a lot of passengers actually being very concerned with, when is the crew going to get home? Are they stuck at these vessels? And what actually happened is that the cruise lines used their vessels to take them out back to India and the Philippines and Indonesia. But that was not really reported about. What you did hear was the crew members being stuck at sea and not being able to go home to their families. And obviously, a lot of them tested positive. So that got also a lot of attention. But at the end of the day, the cruise lines suspended the sailings voluntarily, and they're very much exercising patience. And that's important because they have to rebuild the consumer trust. If they go back to sailing again, they have to make sure that the product is healthy and safe for everybody that wants to go on a cruise, because what they cannot experience is another backlash or another case. So where do we stand? We know that in 2019, cruising was at very much of an all-time high. And then the sailings were canceled, and the CDC position is that the current scientific evidence suggests that cruise ships simply pose a greater risk. In Europe, river cruises started happening again. MSC, the big Italian cruise line, started sailing from Italy again this past weekend, and the entire cruise industry is very much observing that situation to see, are people going to test positive? What is the guest experience like? Was it a wise decision? Because again, losing the consumer trust happens in a heartbeat, and then regaining it can take months. The expectations that we have coming from the industry is that the majority of the sailings will return by Q2 of 2021. And so you'll see in the spring, you'll see Norwegian, Carnival, and Royal Caribbean getting back into it, with the general expectation being that it will take about 4 to 5 years for the cruise lines to go back to the norm of where they were. And a big part of that are the US elections, because nobody anticipates that the current administration will allow for cruising to resume right before an election month in November. If there were another outbreak on a cruise vessel, the backlash would just be too big. So the general expectation is that post the elections, you'll see some movement from CDC as to what might happen. So what are these cruise lines actually doing? They're very much concerned with passenger safety and issuing refunds, making sure that the crew morale is high, because if they return to service, the crew and the level of service that they provided is very much a big part of why people like to cruise, because they're very friendly, they're very warm and kind, and so they need to make sure that those people have a degree of comfort. The logistical nightmare of tying up the vessels was a big issue that they focused on for the first 4 or 5 months. It was not easy to find parking spots for all these big boats. And then we're seeing a lot of destination developments and existing planned destination development projects simply canceled because the cruise lines don't have the capital expenditures anymore. So the vessels that they're building, also the islands that they were planning to build, a lot of those are either paused or postponed. Here you see an image of Royal Caribbean, where you kind of see how the tonnage of the vessels increased significantly. And what you'll probably see is a lot of those vessels on the bottom line there are probably going to be removed as assets because they're not profitable anymore in the new norm. And they're really going to be sailing with a lot more modern and bigger vessels. And that allows the cruise lines to enhance their financial position. It's no surprise that they're bleeding money and raising debt, issuing bonds, the selling off assets, furloughing people, unfortunately. It's a necessity in order to survive. And then, of course, making cruising safe and healthy again. It is the priority, because if people aren't comfortable to take a cruise, then this really strong product that they have will not simply last. The branding and perception. Let's talk a little bit about cruising compared to the airline industry. Why can airlines fly and cruise lines not cruise? Well, it's interesting because branding-wise, the airlines were very quick at being able to rebrand the message of being in a crisis, but being able to communicate and saying, well, we know this sucks, but at least we'll be able to get you home. So they started marketing themselves as being very helpful, whereas the cruise lines had the image put out in the world where they cannot get people home. In fact, they're going to be stuck at the vessels. And so the airlines were quickly to adapt. It kind of became political because the worst thing that the current administration wants to see is another outbreak on the cruise vessel, because how could you approve that again? And then the no sail order is simply a result of that. And so again, post the elections, we'll probably see some movement on that. What did go well? Well, it takes time to rebuild the image, and the cruise lines, they do a pretty good job exercising patience and not rushing to go back to sailings and engaging with their customer base via social media. They're also started to appoint former CDC officials and health experts to really challenge the CDC and these rulings based on an academic merit. And then there was the case of the MSC Magnifica. Didn't get a lot of attention in the media, but it was actually a cruise that left Italy at some point in January or earlier this year. It was about 120 days, and you see the itinerary here. And right at the middle of when people started to social distance, they started buying masks, and they had to go in lockdown, there was actually a community in the world, being this cruise vessel, where people were still living their normal life. And it kind of looked like this. This is a true picture of people of age having a jolly party in the middle of April when the entire world was in lockdown. So the confined environment of a cruise vessel also offers a positive element. We know they have a loyal following. People that cruise, they want to go back to cruising. It's not their first crisis. We had the Costa Concordia. We had other things like 9/11, other viruses, and the cruise lines were always able to adapt well and to really take the benefit of their strong product and vacation value proposition that is unmatched. For $1,000, you can go with your family on a cruise, and you basically have your room paid for. You can visit 4 or 5 different countries. You have food and your own seat. And it's just a value proposition that is hard to match for a Disneyland or Las Vegas experience. And therefore, the product is strong. This is a temporary thing. It's a long-term effort. And with the recognition that the brands have, the NCLs, the Disneys, the Virgins, the Carnivals, the Royals, people will trust those brands, and they will trust them to go back to where they were. In fact, surveys have shown that passengers are more concerned with simply being stuck at sea again than with catching the virus on board. Now, what does it mean for those on the call from the Caribbean nations? It's interdependency. The cruise lines and the Caribbean economies and the tourism industries really rely on each other, and the numbers, they speak for themselves. The cruise lines, just alone in hat taxes, pay about $500 million in fees per year to Caribbean nations. The total spending from the cruise lines and their passengers goes even to $3.5 billion. And then the wages and the jobs are pretty significant too, 80,000 jobs a year. So it's interesting when you develop cruise ports and when you talk about the economics of cruising, how relevant also the crew is. Out of the 25 million passengers that disembark on a cruise destination, 5 million are actually crews. And they buy food too. They go on shore excursions too. They spend money too. And the economic impact is quite sizable. At $100 on average with spending, that's about $2.5 billion in passenger spending a year throughout the region. So imagine the economic impact of not sailing on the Caribbean region. For a country like Jamaica, and you see a picture of Falmouth here, it's about $20 million a month. when are we going to come back? Cruising may not return until 2021. The focus will be initially on the traditional robust markets like Europe, Alaska, and the Caribbean. Bookings are within historical ranges. That means that whenever the cruise lines announce that they want to go sailing again or they postpone the no-sail order, that means that they're almost instantly sold out, all these cruises. So the demand is there. You'll see vessels at 50 to 70% capacity. So if you look at this boardwalk here, it's actually a pretty decent environment to exercise social distancing, especially when you sail at reduced capacity. And then what are the cruise lines doing? Their biggest issue is rebuilding the consumer trust in their product, cruising with comfort, allowing people to cancel right before their cruise, offering insurance policies, offering just balcony rooms only where you have fresh air, contactless payments, no more buffets. In 24 to 36 months, we imagine that all of the vessels that are not sold or scrapped will return to service, potentially with slightly higher pricing simply because the customer is probably willing to pay a little bit extra for the improved, healthier, and safer guest experience. And you'll also see that cruises will likely return for destinations within a 500-mile radius of the traditional home ports in South Florida. So your Tampa, Port Canaveral, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, they funnel a lot of passengers as home ports, and the initial experience will likely be short sailings within that circle that you guys see now on your screen. So the cruise lines, they have a lot of private destinations in the Bahamas. They're very incentivized to push passengers through those destinations because they can control that environment from a health and safety perspective. It's more lucrative for them, and it's a good way to slowly start cruising again. And so the second phase will probably be your Rotans, your Dominican Republic, Puerto Plata, your Belize, your Cozumel. That'll probably be the second phase of cruises, your 5 to 7 weekday itineraries that'll come back too. And so quickly to conclude, cruising offers a travel product that is very strong. They can actually control their environment better than any other environment. Cruises have short memories, which means that a year from now, if the cruise industry has developed a very safe and healthy product, they will cruise again. It's going to be more like a dim light coming back on than just a switch you turn on and off. It's going to be very graduate. And ports must adapt to their communities too. They have to secure the health of their communities too. And all the passengers coming from different countries and different destinations, they present a health risk to the existing destinations in their communities too. We'll likely see less revenues from sailings, that's no surprise, higher costs, and then obviously the interest payments that all the lines have to make for all the debt that they raised during this time to stay afloat. And that's going to mainly impact the secondary markets, your Jacksonville, your Mobile, Alabamas. They're probably going to see a reduction in vessels, but the traditional strong markets like your Caribbean, like your Alaska, like Europe, they'll see a strong volume still being pushed through. And then, of course, to conclude, they have to market their medical care and establish protocols to make sure that if this happens again and a virus can occur 10 years from now or 15 years ago, they can handle this without panicking. And that's it for cruise. So Jorge, if you'd like to take it back.
Hello, everyone. Hi. Yes, thank you, Jelly. I found your presentation very refreshing, very enlightening, very full of information, and of course, it has detonated already a couple of questions that I would like to ask. But we're going to follow the format, so we'll save those questions for the end. And in the meantime, I would like to then introduce Luis Prieto y Muñoz, who is obviously a senior partner in Piedrova Consulting Group. He is a dredging expert. He has presented in several CIP events, CIP events on this very topic. And so he will now talk to us about an issue that was detected to be of interest in this with these stakeholders present here today, which was some sustainability or sustainable aspects of dredging. So without further ado, Luis Prieto, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Jorge. I appreciate the kind introduction, and look forward to hopefully seeing you soon in person at some sort of event or industry day. once all this whole mess is over. So, as Jorge said, the general topic of my presentation today is a brief discussion on CapEx control on cruise and dredging projects. The reason cruise is highlighted, given the circumstances, given the other presentation topic of PCG's role today, thought it would be a good segue to discuss cruise as the hypothetical project that we would be discussing in terms of a hypothetical development in the Caribbean region. So really, the objectives of today's presentation are to discuss sort of in terms of a development standpoint and the sort of developments that you would be seeing, what that sort of hypothetical development outlook looks like. Secondarily, understand the CapEx drivers with a better understanding of dredging, which will kind of be a subtext throughout today's presentation. I'll incorporate that into the general discussion of CapEx, dredging being, at least especially in most of these marine infrastructure projects, particularly greenfield cruise, dredging is by far one of the biggest cost drivers, as well as one of the biggest sustainability and environmental impact drivers. So third, we will discuss the methods in CapEx control that are applied during these sorts of projects. And that's really where a firm like ours steps in. We really do specialize heavily in the CapEx control and risk mitigation elements of the project. Fourth, we'll discuss the regulatory burden, and that's where a lot of these sustainability issues come in. In many regards, all eyes look toward the regulatory authorities as the gatekeepers for sustainability. And we'll discuss briefly some of the methods that are applied there, but also we'll discuss a little bit about what the impacts, what impacts from a regulatory burden look like, specifically with regard to dredging and cruise greenfield projects. And then finally, we'll leave this presentation with a general topic of discussion, which are some of the suggestions that our firm has been putting forward as potential enhancements to the sector and to the region, tweaks and modifications that would likely yield better results moving forward, both safeguarding the very fragile environments that pervade the Caribbean basin, but also ensuring that development and potentially further cruise development won't be unduly burdened or by complicated regulatory bodies. So briefly, and this is a segue from Yella's discussion, kind of harping on one specific facet of it, and that is that there is a regional cruise development outlook. And ultimately, one of the main impacts of the pandemic, to stress what Yella said, is that there will be a refocus on core markets. And specifically, there will be a heavy focus on cruise-only destinations for two reasons. The first is that cruise can control a cruise-only destination, whereas in many cases, an open port cannot be controlled. So where, for example, if you were to take a royal destination in the Bahamas, Coco Cay, which is an island, so obviously everything that comes on to that island is controlled by the cruise line itself. So all the protocols that are instituted by the cruise line to control the spread of any sort of virus or any sort of COVID impact, it can be fully realized on a private destination, and that's not the case in an open format port. So we do expect that medium and long term, there will be a relooking at the development of additional private cruise assets. Secondarily, in the short to medium term, we expect a very large emphasis in the 3 to 4 day cruise itinerary. Yella discussed this at length in terms of what sort of areas we expect will get quite a bit more cruise traffic, and there'll be a reduction in some of the more far-flung destinations that were being emphasized over the last few years. Another major element as to why we expect that cruise-specific developments will enter the market more heavily is that the cruise line can offer a unique product there, which cannot be realized by a traveler in any other context, meaning, for example, Coco Cay, which has some experiential elements such as a hot air balloon that flies over and zip lines and various beach club elements. If you don't go to Coco Cay, you wouldn't experience those elements. And so Royal, and like all the other cruise lines, will utilize their private assets to highlight the reason why a passenger should take a cruise, more so than some other form of travel. So that's where that expectation is coming from. The home porting in Florida, obviously, and now Galveston and Puerto Rico functionally opens the entirety of the region to this 3 to 4 day itinerary. So there is an expectation that really a development anywhere within that 3 to 4 day itinerary sail could potentially be considered strongly for a greenfield development. And finally, there is, while the cruise lines themselves, as Yella discussed aptly, have had a difficulty with their own capital structuring, and they've been really focusing on creating liquidity to make sure that they survive the pandemic. There are external factors that are looking heavily at investing in cruise because they realize that there is now that void. And so there is an expectation, especially in the medium term, that outside capital, and by outside I mean outside of the industry, will facilitate additional development throughout the region. So just to kind of illustrate, if we were to take 3-day sails from Puerto Rico and from Miami, this is obviously similar to the chart Yella just showed, you can see that the absolute majority of the region is incorporated in that 500-mile radius, which is the 3-day sail threshold. If we increase that to a 4-day threshold, we would be pretty much incorporating the entirety of the region, including the northern coast of South America and the eastern coast of Central America. Functionally, the entire basin now becomes viable for that 3 to 4 day itinerary. So moving into a hypothetical dredging project and greenfield development. This particular example is not a greenfield. This is a brownfield project that our firm is engaged on in the Port of Belize. And this gives you a very emblematic example of what a cruise-driven destination would look like. And for the purpose of this presentation, we'll use this as a sample project to discuss the features and discuss the impacts. So what you see here are the really bare essential features that go into a project of this type. And what you see is 4 ships docked on 2 piers. You see the ship sitting in a darker colored shade. That is a berthing area. You see a semicircle just in front of it. That is a turning basin. And beyond that, you have an access channel, which isn't pictured here. Those generally would constitute the navigational features, or what we would call the navigational features of the project. There's nothing particularly esoteric. I'm confident that everybody on this call is familiar with such a with such projects, but in truth, it's this particular part of the project that represents the largest possible impact, especially on a green field. What you see, the next layer up would be the mooring structures, and that's the piers, which you can see the ships are moored to. And that would also include any additional features that would be typical of this sort of thing. For example, mooring or breasting dolphins, sea walks, if those are to be used in lieu of piers, and that sort of thing. And then the final element that would go into this sort of a development would be the upland development, the vertical construction. And what we see here is a link of a tourism village marked in red with a variety of ancillary buildings marked in purple, which provide the fundamental elements of that cruise development, which permit, for example, passenger throughput, key infrastructure, offices, operational control. And then the last layer of this would be utilities. In many of these instances, the scale of these developments are so large that the regional utilities cannot satisfy the demand. So the development itself contemplates an expansion, for example, of sewage treatment or stormwater runoff. And in many cases, they have their own power generation layers and potable water development. So really, that's what makes up a typical Caribbean cruise development, the sort of development that we would see moving forward. The impact tier, essentially from the navigational features up. So the most impactful, generally speaking, would be the dredging, especially if it's capital dredging, followed by the marine structures, the piers, etc. And then lastly, the vertical construction, which typically is located in an area that adjacent to the water. Therefore, there would be potentially some impact, but not nearly as much as the potential for impact in the navigational or in-water features. So really, the major focus of the impact, and this is kind of the way that we're going to look at this from this point forward, while the marine structures and the vertical construction do carry their own impacts, really it's the in-water dredging and the capital dredging particularly where most of those potential impacts are going to be realized. And from a sustainability standpoint, that's really where a lot of attention should be placed. So we look at this from 2 different angles. The first is from an environmental sustainability standpoint, which we'll discuss a little bit later. And the second is from a CapEx control standpoint. CapEx, of course, is referring to the total capital expenditures realized during the construction of the project. And for our purposes, we generally approach this taking the concept and splitting it into 3 different elements. And so for here, the way we're approaching this is the first phase, which is concept development and planning, and this can last for many years prior to the commencement of activities. The second phase would be the design and permitting, so this would be fairly well advanced once a concept is clearly defined. And then the final phase is construction. For the most part, regulatory and sustainability attention gets placed heavily on the construction phase of the project. Realistically, that's where the majority of the risk has already been realized. However, it's when all of the risk is potentially impacted, meaning that it's during the act of construction itself that the riskiness of it is imparted onto the environment. However, from a CapEx control and by extension, from a risk mitigation control standpoint, once the construction phase is initiated, there is almost nothing that can be done to mitigate intrinsic risk. Really, the vast majority of risk is dealt with in the first phase, which is the concept and planning stage of the project. By developing a concept, it automatically imply a certain level of CapEx implication. You also imply a certain level of environmental impact. To use a very trivialized analogy, if you were to build a 10-ship cruise port versus a 1-ship cruise port, you will obviously create a much more expensive project in the 10 cruise ship port scenario, and a much less costly project in the 1 cruise ship port scenario. So it's in that selection of concept where a project owner can impart an enormous amount of CapEx impact. Likewise, in developing a concept, you can impart or remove significant environmental impacts. And so it is at this stage in concept planning where the canon of regulatory body, the identification of the site, the identification of the client's end need are developed, where the vast majority of CapEx control the vast majority of the CapEx can be controlled, and where the majority of planning attention should be placed. Secondarily, in the design and permitting phase is when the regulatory CapEx burden is realized, meaning that the canon of works that have been developed that restrict somebody's ability to, or restrict a developer's ability to construct, is absorbed into the design of the project. And so it's during this phase where a good engineering team and a good project control team will take that concept and synthesize it with the environmental needs that were developed during the investigations and during the study and all that sort of thing, as with the client need. And it is at that point that the vast majority of the project's risk, the project's CapEx control, and the project's environmental impact are determined. Once you reach the third phase, which is the construction phase, the entirety of that has already been developed, meaning that once the trigger is pulled functionally on construction, the only real activity left to do is manage the construction rather than attempt to positively impact CapEx. And by manage, really what that means is attention is placed on attempting to ensure that CapEx isn't exceeded and that no additional costs are imparted onto the project. But at that stage, there's nothing that can be done to reduce the potential CapEx. So an interesting analogy to take in terms of the different entities that are pushing towards the CapEx impacts and sustainability impacts of a project is to use a very trivialized race car analogy. And if you forgive me a little bit of the simplicity here, it works well for us to explain the realization of various risk factors and through the different project phases. So the way we can kind of describe this is the regulator, the government, which is functionally the ruling body, that acts as the organizational body of the race, F1 or NASCAR, if you were to take an example. And so the objective is to set rules that create a sustainability of the sport, meaning that they create a good spectacle, that they create a fair level of competition, and that they ensure that the stakeholder or the fan is afforded what they arrive to do. And in the case of, if we were to take this analogy and apply it to a project, really what that means is safeguarding the environment, safeguarding the economic and social interests of the public. So the project owner is sort of equated to a race team owner, and that is that they are looking to the long term. The asset for themselves is the branding. It's the participation in the race series over a long period of time, where they need to maximize expenditures while enhancing the competitive approach to the race. And then the final layer would be the contractor. And in truth, his main objective is to do as well in a race-by-race scenario as they possibly can within the rules that are set by the organizer and the resources and concept that are afforded by the race team owner. So that gives it just a general view of sort of how we're kind of approaching it. And if you consider concept in this case, which is what the owner is defining, can be heavily defined, can be equated to selection of cars, for example, or the expansion of the program, or how deeply the owner and his team of professionals want to study certain areas or not study certain areas. So it's an analogy that works to a certain extent and can highlight a little bit of the different roles which are going into the project planning phase. Because ultimately what we have is three entities, the government, the project owner, and the contractor, all of whom have aligned but totally disparate goals. And that is, the government wants to ensure preservation of the interests of the public and that the rule of law is observed during the development of the project. The owner seeks to have a functional project within the parameters that they've defined, and the contractor needs to meet the conditions of their contract in the most cost-effective way possible. So while the end result for everybody is the same, a completed race, the path that each of them are taking and their specific elements of success are defined differently. So what is the government's role if we take a look at CapEx and if we take a look at the approach that they have to regulations and by extension sustainability? And ultimately, the government's role in CapEx is imparted by regulation and processes. Specifically, and we'll discuss this method-driven comment a little bit later, but ultimately, by the government developing regulations that control activities in water, and by government controlling the processes by which a project owner can get approvals, they impart burden on the project. In the Caribbean, from an environmental standpoint, we primarily feel these in terms of water quality and benthic protection, meaning we have very clear and high quality water in the Caribbean, so turbidity generated from a dredging activity, for example, is very noticeable. And secondarily, benthic protection. We have coral reefs and a number of different species of protected species throughout the Caribbean, many of which draw the actual tourists that are coming to that development in the first place. So it's crucial that those two are protected. And it's because of these unique resources that these two elements primarily are what we see in Caribbean developments, primarily dredge-heavy developments. From a regulatory burden standpoint, the better understood and the more common the regulatory language is, the less that will burden the project. And what that means is that a rule, regardless of how stringent it may be, is, as long as it's understood and it's appropriate within the confines of the project, generally speaking, that burden will be minimized. However, conversely, if the language of a law or its application are a bit esoteric or ad hoc, there will be a significant impact on the project. And we do see that with some regularity. Certain rules are instituted within a microregion, meaning one specific municipality within a very specific region might have a uniquely exigent water quality control rule. That rule doesn't necessarily exceed the stringent standards of its neighboring agencies. However, if it's written strangely or its application is not uniform, a contractor will price that risk very heavily. And the impact of that regulation on the capex of the project increases commensurately. So ultimately, the way we view the role of the regulator is to preserve the asset and preserve the protection of the public while providing a fair and appropriate framework for development. And so really the goal is to provide a rule of law and a process structure that allows for the protection without unduly impacting the potential for developing and creating economic opportunity. If we were to take a sample greenfield dredging project like we've been discussing, typically you'll have impacts across the marine, terrestrial, and social spheres. From marine environment, it's obvious a dredge-heavy project is going to have major changes within a region. It'll create potentially turbidity. It could potentially damage habitat or destroy habitat depending on where the project is sited. Deepening a channel or expanding a turning basin or building marine structures can have long-term effects on the hydrodynamic forces that surround an island. So really, from an environmental standpoint, there's a lot of marine impact that, if not fully studied, can be realized with the development of projects. Because of the region, and as we discussed briefly in the previous slide, it is primarily on the environmental side, specifically with water quality and benthic flora and fauna, where these sorts of projects have an impact. And these are much more realized under capital dredging conditions, because capital dredging, by its own definition, is the creation of new depth within an area. So as opposed to maintenance dredging, which is restoration of depth in a project or feature that already existed. So really, if we're looking at the environmental impact of one of these projects, the majority of our attention first always goes to the dredging side of it and ensuring that the dredging is appropriate, that the marine feature itself is sited appropriately within the environmental context of where it's being contemplated. And then finally, that the application of proper water quality controls are applied across the project itself. Also, there's generally a social impact associated with most of these projects. For the most part, those impacts are positive, meaning that there's a creation of tourism, there's a creation of trade. So by extension, there's a creation of wealth through jobs, through added commerce, through added trade benefit. However, there are potential for negative impacts, and we normally see those in terms of loss of habitat or loss or environmental loss. As I discussed, a lot of the draw in the Caribbean region is the pristine environment. It's the coral reefs, it's the fishing, it's the beaches, it's the crystalline water. It's all of these features that draw these large crowds of tourists. So if you adversely impact those touristic features, there is a loss of income. Similarly, there is a intrinsic value to all of these natural resources, to both the local and regional and global, in some cases, sphere. So a potential loss of any of that has wide-reaching social impact. And ultimately, the best path that a government has to treating all of these impacts and ensuring the sustainability of a dredge-heavy marine infrastructure project is the ESIA process. The vast majority of governments require an ESIA, which is an environmental and social impact assessment, or some other nomenclature of it, either EIA or EIS, just to use different acronyms. But ultimately, these processes are pretty common throughout the region. I don't think that there are any countries that do not have this as a part of their greenfield development standards. But ultimately, this is also a path to the greatest project CapEx impact, potentially. So from our view, and this is something we'll discuss at the very end of this presentation, but in order to ensure that an ESIA process safeguards the sustainability and the long-term success of a project, at a minimum, it must consider the base site and baseline conditions. And by site conditions, that means a deep and thorough understanding of the subsoil conditions, of the hydrodynamic conditions, of the meta-ocean conditions, all of those parameters that create the concept of site, of the place where the project is being developed. Secondarily, it's important to understand the baseline conditions, meaning what currently exists, not just in the project, but also within the project's impact zone. And that can include social elements, but more relevantly, it usually includes environmental elements, documenting the sea conditions, documenting potential reefs, documenting the species that pervade the area, documenting, for example, migratory birds that might take advantage of the area as a rest stop. So it's important that those baselines are understood, because if your intent through the EIA is to preserve baseline conditions, then it's extremely important that those are well documented. Beyond that, it's important that there's an impartial assessment of the impact on those baselines. And many times the EIA process is taken a little bit cynically, where impacts are downplayed or various salesmanship is incorporated into the document. So it's very, very important that an impact assessment from that standpoint is impartial and truly the full scope of the project's impact is assessed. Another major element is the assessment of an alternative. Many times there are very positive impacts that are highlighted in these assessments, and that's fair. But it is important to consider and highlight what other elements were considered during that process and why it is that the path that's being proposed is the one that's being undertaken. And then finally, every country has its own canon of regulatory law, which governs development activities, be that through noise control or carbon emissions or water quality conditions or whatever that is. So it's important that any of these assessments show how the project intends to comply, prove compliance, and finally mitigate the inevitable impacts. That said, many EIAs carry a significant procedural burden. And in many cases, some of these EIA processes can run into the multi-year and in many cases decade-long processes. And while it's good that these thorough standards are applied on the project, it is very important that the study area is linked, that the time of study is linked to the overall project duration, meaning that the baseline studies and the environmental assessments are done within a reasonable time frame and linked to the construction start. Because otherwise, if 10 years go by from when the baseline study was done until construction start, it's not all that reflective. And those have negative impacts both to CapEx and to the environment. And so finally, just the general topic of discussion and where we kind of want to discuss the potential areas for improvement is that from a regulatory standpoint, it's important to focus on impacts and not methods. And what that means is that the impact of a activity is what should be controlled. The way that the contractor attempts to get there shouldn't. And the reason for that is that innovation is not reflected in regulation. It's very difficult for laws to be adapted quickly enough to keep up with technological advances in the industry. Contractors, in order to maintain efficiency, will usually keep up far more so, but the regulations do not. So it's important to unchain the regulatory, to unchain the program from those regulatory burdens, because ultimately they neither benefit the environment nor do they benefit the project CapEx. So second, a normalization of the ESIA process across the region. The disparate approaches to the ESIA can complicate things. And while a lot of small governments don't have the wherewithal to pursue this and create very elaborate ESIA processes themselves, a regional approach might remedy that. Many of the projects that we see, especially in Cruz, rely on development bank funding as part of the debt components of these projects. All of these development banks have well-developed international standards for ESIAs. We suggest that a lot of these, that the region should look very heavily at incorporating these standards into their own national ESIA standards, which would streamline and also rely on some very well-established performance guidelines that are internationally accepted. The lockboxing of the ESIA process is important. What that means is ensuring that everybody who is going through the ESIA process is afforded a transparent due process. We've seen many projects where a partial regulator denied a developer due process, and that development is approved through a legal process rather than an environmental one, and it neither benefits the developer nor does it benefit the environment because the safeguards weren't fully fledged. And finally, it's developing a canon of regulatory guidelines that are applicable throughout the region. Every country has its own needs, and that's undeniable. But there are certain issues that affect the entirety of the Caribbean and to be very valuable if certain guidelines, for example, water quality control guidelines, could be normalized across the region, helping both preserve CapEx, but also, more importantly, create a verifiable and easily adaptable water quality control standards during these developments. And that is, in a nutshell, a brief discussion on CapEx and sustainability issues with cruise-centric development throughout the Caribbean. Jorge?
Well, thank you, Luis, very much. Indeed. There are questions coming in here through the chat and stuff that I will be happy to ask you in a little bit once we're done with the next presenter. But again, Luis, thank you very much. Very interesting. I learned a lot through this presentation, stuff I you know about, but now I know about it. So thank you again, Luis, for an excellent presentation. And let me pass on to our last presenter of the day, Miguel Angel Osuna Teran, who I haven't seen in a while, so it'll be good to see him, good friend. And Miguel Angel will approach and will speak to us to sort of round off and complement about some of safety and security aspects of port operations. So, Miguel Angel, please take the floor. Adelante.
Thank you very much, Jorge, to everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Miguel Osuna. I'm a master miner as well, with specializations, different ones, across the port maritime sectors on behalf of the IMO. So this is going to be like super condensed. I appreciate any questions you have, please, as Jorge stated it, let him know. Let's just begin. Let's get on with it. Sharing the screen. Let's go. Superb. So I'm going to be addressing a lot of the topics that were previously. Let's start. So thank you very much again for allowing us to be part of this webinar series.
Miguel,
sí.
Can you put, because I'm seeing your presentation and the next slide. You understand what I'm saying? I'm seeing.
Do you prefer it like this? Okay.
Yes.
You see this?
So much.
Right.
This
for some reason, yeah, I couldn't share the just this one. Okay, let's go with it.
Sorry.
All right. So we know we have to go back to a new normal. Everyone's mentioning it. I want to address this since Mr. Prince already did. Let's just go on ahead. Okay, what's going on? The CLIA, which is the Cruise Lines International Association, I know most of you know about this, but they have already announced a third voluntary suspension until the 31st of October 2020. What's going on next? A lot of, as Mr. Prince mentioned as well, there has been a lot of negative media, yellow press against the maritime industry, but it's obvious and it's to be expected since it is such a safe industry. And considering the cruise sector or the cruising industry is compared to the global maritime one, it's so little, but still generates so much revenue. So it's obviously going to be entirely addressed every single time it gets by the press. So here we have one of the reasons, like the Ruby Princess, which was docked or birthed at the in Australia, received this sort of attention. We see from this news portal that in total they had 6,600 cases, right, of COVID, of which the Ruby Princess was related to 690 of them, meaning 10% of them. Now, this obviously generated a trend of news across the globe, and I want to show you this, which I believe is one of the most of the principal topics here that I really, really recommend you reading or addressing, which is it's a recent study published by Hiroshi Toito and Shinya Hanaoka on May, basically this year, right, where they address the reasons of contagion inside the cruising industry. I want to show you this from this study. These are the countries from which trips generated and to which trips returned. All right, meaning the United States of America had a total of 4 million passengers landing and 600,000 COVID cases derived from them. Now, they say that this is obviously in part as well because these ports of call to which ships are arriving to are in part linked to international airports, which is right. You see Mexico on second place with 2,005,000 cases, which is still way less COVID cases than in the case of the United States. Now, we see the 10 first countries in the world, meaning that obviously is not the fault of the cruising industry. We're talking here about the integration of different chains of healthcare services, right? And we are seeing them faulty. Next. This is another very interesting graphic. They compared a bunch of different ships with the amounts of, you see down here, the amount of ships and cases, and over here on the left side on the y-axis you see the passenger capacity. We basically determined that the bigger the capacity, no, the higher, obviously the higher the contagion. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this was addressed previously, but this is hard data, this is hard facts. It's going to be very, very interesting to see how the industry is going to address a close quarter situations where there's a lot of people living together, basically. We already know this. This is just to explain how big the income and the economic impact of cruises in general are. They benefit everything around. They can make up to 8% of the gross product of the country they arrive to. So we're talking that the ceasing of operations has enormously impacted, obviously, especially our brothers, our Caribbean brothers. Well, here we know Mr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, which is who's the director of the World Health Organization. We all know how he informed everyone that, well, guys, this is a pandemic. We have to start taking action, which is what we're seeing right now, part of it. How do we know when we have to get out of quarantine, right? Bear with me because, as I said before, this is a very good story that I need you all to understand and consider. Now, first, we have to flatten the curve. That's what everyone is saying, sure. And we have to train society. Yes, that's correct. Prevention measures must be instated. That's correct as well. Have we? Well, some of us have. We thought we had until, well, on the 3rd of August, we realized that the Norwegian cruise line has suspended activity because of a new outbreak on one of their ships. So what's going on here? Are we supposed to be establishing all this? Were we on a ready status? Well, we saw at first that the CLIA had already established a voluntary extension of the no selling order. Another news from, in this case, from the United Nations, we have 200,000 seafarers stranded, 200,000 who are not being able to be repatriated, right? That's another problem we're currently facing. We don't have the means to ensure that the maritime crews and offshore personnel are able to go in and out through the appropriate means, let me say, through the appropriate scanning. And we are stopping the entire maritime industry. Not really trying to, right? But out of fear, and we'll see why, we're having negative consequences. Now, what's the IMO doing about this? Well, a lot, actually, a whole lot. 26 circulars have been issued since the beginning of April. This is very important, and take a picture of this, because circular letter 4204 is crucial in this aspect. Through it, it has created a recommendation framework of protocols. It has issued comprehensive questions and answers. It has instated a seafarer crisis action team, never heard before. So this is huge. It has been just like us, been interested in the communication of all these measures through webinars, and it has been constantly kept active through statements and messages. Look at this. This is a tweet from the IMO saying that the Seafarer Crisis Action Team is working tirelessly to help people get off ships, especially considering when they are in like abnormal circumstances and situations. What else is he doing? Look at this. IMO is endorsing new protocols. Why? To let people go home. He's supporting seafarers on the front line by giving them the key status as key personnel, meaning they are essential, and people should be, all communities, all countries, our countries should be enforcing, at least trying to enforce this. We'll see later the legal consequences. Here, even though it says that protecting seafarers, helping seafarers go home, this is what I care the most here on this article. Protecting seafarers' mental health, derived from the MLC, the Marine Labor Convention 2006, which states that all seafarers have the right to all sorts of care, and including mental health care. And it's helping getting people off ships as well. It is sharing testimonies of people stranded across the globe on different ships. How much more invested can we ask an international authority to be? Now, just a quick picture of this. This is Circular 4204, all right? I'm just gonna touch all of the addenda because it's insanely and huge amount of time and content, but I do recommend you go through them. All right, especially if you are a maritime authority or port authority. We don't have to invent anything. It's already been done for us. We just have to make sure we implement that to our level. Right, so here what I want you to take notice is the addendum 4, the International Chamber of Shipping guidances, as well as the managing COVID outbreaks on board ships. All right, that's addendum 3. On 26, gentlemen and ladies, 26, all right? The joint statement between the IMO and the World Customs Organization to preserve supply chain. Why? Because we need things to arrive to countries. It's a fact, especially if they are medical care devices and supplies. The same, another a statement with the World Health Organization and the ILO. The European Commission is in. We'll see it later. The Port Authorities Roundtable is in. Here, addendum 14. It's awesomely good. You have to check this. It's a framework of protocols, right? Just take that and adapt it to the national regulatory framework. You will win. We will win. It's a fact, and we'll see later why. Now, addendum 16, how to perform ship-shore interfaces, and addendum 17, how to resume operations post-COVID. This is key. Then we have where the addendum 18, where they conferred the all maritime industry personnel the status um, of essential personnel, along with the International Civil Aviation Organization. We're talking of three huge industry leading, obviously, efforts. Um, Addendum 20, guys, in respect of the how we need to remove paperwork is essential. That's what we're doing right now, right? Using technology. That's how we should do it. The Singapore Addendum 22, Singapore Crew Change Guidebook for everyone who doesn't know how to perform crew logistics properly. This is the go-to document. And finally, this is just awesome. The Addendum 26, guidance on the gradual and safe resumption of operations of cruise ships. This just came out less than a month ago. Okay, so I'm going to actually be talking about that. What does it say? This is what it says. It's a European Union guidance for cruise ship operations and how to perform them. It's huge, but it's all digested here. It's very condensed. What does it say? On the first part, addresses the operations on the ship side, right? And asks to develop a COVID-19 company and ship management plan. Guys, we know where this is heading. We know we're going to systematize everything because we don't want it to happen again. This is the 9/11 of pandemics. Okay, we have to think about it that way and relate to it. So, how are we going to do it? Are we going to create this ship management plan? The same way we've always done it, through risk management, right? And later on, through verification, make sure that everything is in place. Um, I don't believe we should be calling, I mean, due to the circumstances, it's going to be called COVID-19, obviously, but it should be more like pandemic or pathogen oriented or pathogen prevention, etc. Because right now we have COVID, but in the future, 7 years, whatever, if hopefully will not happen, but if it does happen, we will have this in place already. Now, on the second part, we have the same as in the first, but directed to the port authorities, right? So we have the port management plan through member states, on ports and port terminals, all right? Receiving cruise ships. This is essential, right? Meaning every single thing that was previously said about ports and port terminals, they will have to incorporate this new management plan. And the third and last part of this Union guidance, European Union guidance, sorry, is the interface between both the prior mentioned two. All right. So that's how we're gonna do it. Yes, we are seeing risk of we are analyzing the risk of the coronavirus, of course. The shipping companies are going to have huge responsibilities in this. Right now, these are just recommendations, but as always, everything starts as a recommendation. All right. Eventually, this will become the norm. The norm. That is the new normal. That is the analysis. That's what has been going on, and that's what's going to happen for guaranteed. Now we see the pattern. We see it. The IMO is doing an excellent work, right? And are we not paying close attention to what's going on? We have got to give that a chance right now and incorporate to whatever we're doing. So let us start. Now, what is the ILO doing? The ILO action in times of a pandemic, of the pandemic. Well, just like the IMO, it has started I created a recommended framework of protocols, right? Just like it. Now we have several institutions doing it, so we know where this is going. It has issued a joint statement on the special tripartite committee of the Maritime Labor Convention. Is going to tie everything back to the MLC 2006, all right? And it has also created a world of work, an impact and policy response exactly due to the COVID-19. This is one of the news from its website. It's demanding all members to treat seafarers with dignity and respect. The same thing we previously saw the IMO granting the seafarers the status of essential workers, well, is being backed up by the ILO. What are we doing in the Caribbean? What are we doing in our region? Where do we stand? Are we listening to what they're saying? The honest truth is we are not. And this is directly taken up to date from the ITF website, where we see most of the dots in red and or white with a blue circle around it, meaning that the blue circle with white, meaning that the ITF has not been informed or no protocols have been issued or sent to the international organizations regarding crew changes, all right? How they are performing crew changes. The only countries so far complying are Panama and Puerto Rico, señores and señoras, okay? This is alarming because the information is there, the recommendations are there, the technical assistance is there. Why aren't we doing this? Alarming. Now, these are legal consequences, all right? I'm not going to delve into this because it's a lot, it's a wall of text. I promise, these are my only walls of text, and I won't go through them, but the presentation will be there, all right? So take a look at this. These are the international agreed upon rules, regulations, and articles that back up the international response currently in place, right? All of this, it's a lot. We have the MLC and we have the Seafarers Identity Documents Convention from ILO as well. So we see international organizations making the gears turn, right? With all of this, they have also already started working, laying out the framework. They all point towards a new management system to mitigate the effects of future pandemics. The new normal comes with new risks, that's obvious, but also new ways to mitigate them. These are all the challenges that my previous brother at arms orators have already instated. But just to name a few, the shipping industry and the cruise industry are going to have to rethink everything. Everything from shipbuilding to ticket prices to business models to user experience to marketing campaigns to training, because now the passengers will have to be trained, because you will not be able to sustain these sort of management systems without incorporating users to to them. So just finishing up, concluding. Thank you, Jorge. I know I'm not super condensed. The time has already flown by. As the CLNA said, cruises will sail again. We will sail again. We captains, we passengers, we crew members, stronger and better than ever, as a result of this, when the time is right. All right. They said before, beginning of next year. I truly believe so. And just paraphrasing a very famous poet, Khalil Gibran, in his poem like that, the farewell, I shall return with the tide. Et comme les marins nous reviendront, with the tides will return. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for your attention. Captain Miguel Osuna, adios, Seves. Thank you, Jorge.
Capitan Miguel Osuna Terán, first of all, a big hug, my friend. Good to see you. It is refreshing to have a presentation with your energy and your passion about this, which, as we know, is something that you and your father share, and I respect you and admire you for that. So thank you very much, Miguel Angel, for this wonderful presentation on several security aspects of precisely the cruise industry. I wondered if our friend from Real ID could put Luis Prieto and Jelle Prince back on the screen so that they may help to answer some questions that have been asked. I have questions for everybody. So let me start with this one. I think directed more to Jelle and to to Luis. And it is a question, says, I'm wondering if the cruise lines would see it beneficial to and safe to initiate Southern Caribbean cruise itineraries from a hub such as Barbados with a focus on European clients, even if they reopen at limited operations. So let me ask questions again. Would it be beneficial and safe to initiate Southern Caribbean cruise itineraries from a hub such as Barbados with a focus on European clientele? Keep that one in mind. Keep that one in mind, because there's a very related one. So, Jele and Luis, if you could be short and succinct in answering this question, I will then ask Miguel Angel one that has more to do with what he talked about. You guys have the floor.
So I think the answer is inevitably yes, certainly. I think the concept behind being able to approach from a variety, ultimately spread the sail risk over several countries would be ideal. The complexity with any itinerary origin and completion point is the layer of logistical interface that needs to be added to it. So a cruise originating from Barbados would require the entire ship resupply to be able to take place in Barbados. And if it's a short-term itinerary, that would have to happen every 3 to 4 days. And a cruise ship resupply, especially some of the size that are becoming more common, especially if social distancing gets incorporated into modern cruising, then resupply will be interesting. So that would be one of the complexities that would have to be overcome. The other being the passenger throughput with baggage and being able to basically fill the ship and offload the ship within a very, very short turnaround. But I do know that there's been a lot of emphasis placed on potentially homeporting ships elsewhere, and certainly the Southern Caribbean, Southeastern Caribbean, is a major, major asset. And I know that there's a lot of attention being placed on it because of the value and interest of the region. So I think that there would be interest, and I think that the logistical hurdles is really what can control that. They've just overcome those with San Juan, as we've recently seen. So I'm sure that there's attention to it. Yel, is there anything you could add there?
Well, I think it's a short to your point. I think in general, the cruise lines will go first back to what has worked in the past. What has been traditional, the Caribbean market is traditional, Alaska is a traditional home market, and Europe. And I think in general, it's a great idea, but I would think the lines would have some reluctancy to try out a new itinerary home porting from the Southern Caribbean at this time, perhaps at a later date. But I think they will first start with the utmost basic itineraries from their traditional home ports.
Okay, thank you very much. I see more questions. I'm going to ask Miguel Angel to please try and field this one. It says, as such, it says, due to new biosecurity regulations, in addition to the new security process that would have been applied to cruise terminals, what main changes would you suggest that are made in regulations or concessions in order to incentivize the cruises activity in the region? Let me repeat that. Due to the new biosecurity regulations, in addition to the new security processes that would be applied or to be applied to cruise terminals, what main changes would you suggest take place in the regulations or concessions in order to motivate the cruises activity in the region?
I'm going to relate that to what Mr. Prieto said before, right? And that's private investment capital distributed across the Caribbean or in the ports of call or destinations. I'm going to relate to that because should the industry fail to jump on the train, or in this case, the cruise of those who are leaders in the market in the cruising industry, they will not be considered as suppliers, all right? And that's going to create a huge loss in the respective destinations. Now, this is obviously going to be a joint effort between all the main actors in the region, from ship owners to port authorities and private sector in general. So the main considerations that we're going to have to think about are those related to basic screening and training, right? Because these are going to be generalized throughout every single process and procedure that we create. Obviously, Mr. Prieto and Yale previously mentioned the importance of having all this through a modification of the general status quo on board ships, especially due to social distancing. That being said, we will be looking at a decrease in ticket sales, that's for sure. But also from the security standpoint, we will be seeing also an increase perhaps in access times and the way people are being processed prior and before they leave the ships. We're also considering how the ships are going to be assisting those on onshore explorations or onshore excursions, because they're going to have to maintain a sanitized status around the people leaving the ship. So who are going to be able to provide that? Obviously the suppliers. So they're going to this amount of this whole idea of new processes will have to permeate as in a cascade through all the supply chain, Jorge.
I understand what you're saying. I agree. In fact, another question that I have, and this is for the three of you, because we have port authorities here participating and stuff, and we thus far have ascertained that the cruise industry is taking measures to keep the passengers on the ships safe. New filters, no buffet, all the measures that have been mentioned, with rooms facing away from the ocean, so whatever. So the ship is doing all it can to give the security and the sense of reliability and assurance to the passengers that they can come to their ship. We've also spoken about the ship-port interface and how that must adhere with, you spoke about IMO circulars and about, protocols, and everybody's doing it, which is great. So now we know that if you get on a ship, that ship will be clean, and now you can get off with the Port Authority and at the terminal through clean procedures of the port ship interface. The thing, my friends, is what is your recommendation? What happens after the port? How can one as a passenger feel safe going to a restaurant or to a bar or taking a tour of whatever, whether it's the falls in Jamaica, or where you go in a lagoon in St. Lucia, or where that's the part I think that is the second, it's part B. Or you can do like in Europe, like, some ship sailed and stopped at the port of call, but nobody got off. It was just, keep in the ship. But I don't think that's the idea of the cruise basin, of the Caribbean basin, because here what we like is to get off the ship, explore, have an encounter with nature, buy handicrafts, interact with the people, and this is how it's. So in your opinion, and with this, I think, because it's coming in 1:30, we'll have to end the Q&A session. But what would be your recommendation, Jelle, Luis, and Miguel, on how to deal with this post-port aspect of the cruise?
Well, you bring up a good dialogue, a good question, Jorge, because it's something that the cruise lines have been extremely worried about. And their answer is, well, just book your tour with us and we can control that, which conflicts with a lot of folks at the destinations, because their tour operators want to remain independent, and they are typically already under a little bit of pressure from the cruise lines, where if you book a tour on a cruise vessel, then they're going to take a significant cut, and where does that leave me? And what you're seeing with MSC on their initial cruises this weekend is that they're saying you can go on a tour, but they're going to be smaller groups, they're going to be with trusted operators, and they're going to be tours that you have to book through us, so we can control that environment too. And that's what we're seeing. I'm not sure if the captain, Miguel Angel or Luis,
yes. I will gladly add to what you just laid out, and it's in the latest decade, all right, the negotiation balance has tipped over to the maritime industry. In this case, to the cruise sector, the cruise industry. Now they have more negotiation power, and that's a fact. Okay. Now considering that, what are port authorities and suppliers or providers able to sorry for the redundance, but to provide as a valid as an added value to the shipping, in this case, cruising industry, because if they are not able to match what the companies per se can achieve by their own, giving just like Jill said, compartmentalized experiences, right, where they don't need to get out of their own facilities and developments, then they will they will they will not be partaking into that piece of their profits. That's a fact. So they will have to align their standards nationally, especially to with when speaking with the for the islands, nationally, to those of the companies. That's going to be very necessary in order to close the loop and not allow for potential a additional hazards, so to speak. I agree with you, Chile.
To add to that, and just for the sake of all of us going through it, I think what's a unique element of cruising is that really, if you have to kind of separate the cruise from the cruise itself versus an instrument of tourism. So in many respects, a cruise ship represents its own experience, and then you've got the added layer of the cultural adventure beyond it. So to put it slightly differently, I think the majority of the emphasis for a cruise line today is on what measures they can take to mitigate the COVID impact within the sphere that they control. And that is two primary places. One is the ship and the potential contact spread within the ship itself. And secondly, it's the destinations that the line would control. For example, the MSC, MSC Ocean Cay Marine Reserve, or Coco Cay in the Bahamas, or Labadee in Haiti. Any of these destinations that the cruise line entirely controls, that's where their first emphasis will go. In what degree can they limit the exposure of their passengers to COVID in the space that cruise is king? When you add the next layer of that, which is the cruise ship as a vehicle of tourism, it becomes a little bit more complex for the cruise line to control beyond that point. Because ultimately, yes, a cruise ship docks in San Juan and the passengers disembark. A number of those passengers may go on a rainforest tour. A number of those passengers may go on a cruise originating carriage ride. But a vast number of those passengers will go experience Old San Juan on their own. And they'll go interact with the city on their own. And there's nothing that neither the cruise line nor really the government can do to impact the behavior of those passengers beyond the behavioral changes that are being instituted today in our day-to-day lives. So then the complexity of the question is divorcing the concept of cruise from the concept of day-to-day existence / an individual tourist enjoying the touristic experience. So I think really when it comes to cruise, there's going to be a lot of changes that are being made at the cruise level, and the cruise lines are instituting all these different protocols and social distancing measures and removing all these different potential hazard points that we've discussed, like doorknobs and self-opening doors, buffets, etc. But when you get to the next layer of that, which is what that cruise passenger does in the port of call, that's no different than us going to a restaurant today, or you using the metro, or you interacting with the public as a whole. It's incumbent, I think, on every single individual, and it's well beyond the reach of the cruise line.
Right. Again,
just to finish, to wrap this up, I'm going to drop in a pop culture reference. In the movie called The Fifth Element, I don't know if you guys remember, but the cruise company, which had this interstellar ship, owned the planet with the beaches. All right. So this is what's going to happen. They're going to attempt to control everything from the voyage experience to the additional complementary experiences or cultural experiences, like Mr. Prieto said, in order to guarantee the client, in this case, a controlled environment. That's going to be it.
Right. Well, I agree. I think that this will have to be necessarily in phases. and perhaps, you know, the island owned by the cruise ships, in which they can in fact exert more control, will be a first layer of destinations, and then as the cruise starts going around, I think that as one of the participants just let me know, it says, you know, the restart of cruising with limited interaction tours that will be highly controlled will be offered at the destinations only to those cruise lines that are confident that the protocols have been informed in that port of call. So I think we're going to let it go. That one last thing, gentlemen, I just want to make sure of something. But in addition to what we're talking about, I understand that the country in which this happens, in this something were to happen, has to guarantee support from local public health authorities and give assistance if there's an outbreak on board as well. Is that right? I just want to double check that.
I'm sorry, Jorge, could you please repeat that?
Yeah, that the country in which, let's say, God forbid, you know, it comes into, you know, my favorite place in the world, the island of doesn't exist, and then people come in there, and then all of a sudden a person gets sick in town, and he's got the fever, or she, and has got all the symptoms. Now, I understand if this happens, the country needs to also guarantee that that person and would be immediately taken to, you know, respond to that emergency, and then provide a service to the ship, to the people who are on board, as well as that may be needed. So what I'm trying to say is wherever something happens, that they need to take responsibility for it. Is that correct?
That is correct. Actually, in my presentation, you can see that derived from the World Health Organization International Health guidelines. I don't remember exactly the article, but the countries that have ratified this agreement have the responsibility directly to provide all assistance to crew members. I'm talking from like Medivac to getting medical care, healthcare in that country, and then it links it to the other international instruments that allow for that country to give safe passage and repatriation to that seafarer to their country of origin, as well as they can never restrict the access of ships to their ports under any circumstance where they are required precisely to evacuate people or to receive supplies to maintain health and safety standards on board. So yes, that your question, the answer to your question is yes, they are responsible to by international law.
Well, thank you very much. Martin Santillán from ID Orbit, could we bring Carlos and Miguel Ángel Osuna Sr. back so that we can conclude what I think has been a very successful and very interesting webinar. As you can see, we've had an active participation from the audience asking questions, and I have more questions. Unfortunately, we've gone past the hour and a half. It's 1:38 over here, and I know that people have things to do and lunches to have and whatnot. I thank you everyone for your participation. Those who asked questions, thank you for doing that and for getting the dialogue out there. But, you know, I'd like to just say goodbye and give the floor back to the speakers and Carlos and Miguel Ángel so that they can say their goodbyes. But all I have to say is thank you, Miguel Ángel Osuna Terán. Thank you, Jelle, Lord of the Scottish Highlands. Thank you very, very much. It's always a pleasure. Don Luis, muchísimas gracias, as always. And with that, I want to thank Real ID for their technological support, and La Red, the Mexico International ISPS Network, with Miguel Ángel and Carlos Escarpín, who I now give the floor to. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you, George.
Sure.
Have a good day.
Gracias a todos. Merci à tous. Thank you very much.
We have some of the people saying goodbye, and some private greetings here and there. But again, thank you very much, Miguel Ángel, Luis, Ejele. Let me remind everyone also that we will have these presentations in the SIP portal. I am asking permission from the three of you to please send them over, and then we will upload them to the portal under the banner for this event. We will do that. We will upload the presentations. People have been asking how they can get them. So now that we have your, they should be there in a couple of days where you could find